just did something I'd never done before. I spent a week at sea on a research vessel. Now, I'm not a scientist, but I was accompanying a remarkable scientific team from the University of South Florida who have been tracking the travels of BP's oil in the Gulf of Mexico. This is the boat we were on, by the way. The scientists I was with were not studying the effect of the oil and dispersants on the big stuff, the birds, the turtles, the dolphins, the glamorous stuff. They're looking at the really little stuff that gets eaten by the slightly less little stuff that eventually gets eaten by the big stuff. And what they're finding is that even trace amounts of oil and dispersants can be highly toxic to phytoplankton, which is very bad news because so much life depends on it. So contrary to what we heard a few months back about how 75% of that oil sort of magically disappeared and we didn't have to worry about it, this disaster is still unfolding. It's still working its way up the food chain. Now, this shouldn't come as a surprise to us. Rachel Carson, the godmother of modern environmentalism, warned us about this very thing back in 1962. She pointed out that the control men, as she called them, who carpet-bombed towns and fields with toxic insecticides like DDT, were only trying to kill the little stuff, the insects, not the birds. But they forgot this: the fact that birds dine on grubs, that robins eat lots of worms, now saturated with DDT. And so robin eggs failed to hatch, songbirds died en masse, towns fell silent. Thus the title, Silent Spring. I've been trying to pinpoint what keeps drawing me back to the Gulf of Mexico, because I'm Canadian and I can draw no ancestral ties. And I think what it is that I don't think we have fully come to terms with the meaning of this disaster, with what it meant to witness a hole ripped in our world, with what it meant to watch the contents of the earth gush forth on live TV 24 hours a day for months. After telling ourselves for so long that our tools and technology can control nature, suddenly we were face to face with our weakness, with our lack of control, as the oil burst out of every attempt to contain it. Top hats, top kills, and most memorably, the junk shot, the bright idea of firing old tires and golf balls down that hole in the world. But even more striking than the ferocious power emanating from that well was the recklessness with which that power was unleashed, the carelessness, the lack of planning that characterized the operation from drilling to cleanup. If there is one thing BP's watery improv act made clear, it is that as a culture, we have become far too willing to gamble with things that are precious and irreplaceable, and to do so without a backup plan, without an exit strategy. And BP was hardly our first experience of this in recent years. Our leaders barrel into wars, telling themselves happy stories about cakewalks and welcome parades. Then it is years of deadly damage control, Frankensteins of sieges and surges and counterinsurgencies, and once again, no exit strategy. Our financial wizards routinely fall victim to similar overconfidence, convincing themselves that the latest bubble is a new kind of market, the kind that never goes down. And when it inevitably does, the best and the brightest reach for the financial equivalent of the junk shot, in this case, throwing massive amounts of much-needed public money down a very different kind of hole. As with BP, the hole does get plugged, at least temporarily, but not before exacting a tremendous price. We have to figure out why we keep letting this happen, because we are in the midst of what may be our highest stakes gamble of all, deciding what to do or not to do about climate change. The truth is that we have already exhausted so much of the easily accessible fossil fuels that we have already entered a far riskier business era, the era of extreme energy. So that means drilling for oil in the deepest water, including the icy Arctic seas, where a cleanup may simply be impossible. It means large-scale hydraulic fracking for gas and massive strip mining operations for coal, the likes of which we haven't yet seen. And most controversially, it means the tar sands. I'm always surprised by how little people outside of Canada know about the Alberta tar sands, which this year are projected to become the #1 source of imported oil to the United States. It's worth taking a moment to understand this practice because I believe it speaks to recklessness and the path we're on like little else. So this is where the tar sands live, under one of the last magnificent boreal forests. The oil is not liquid. You can't just drill a hole and pump it out. Tar sands oil is solid, mixed in with the soil. So to get at it, you first have to get rid of the trees. Then you rip off the topsoil and get at that oily sand. The process requires a huge amount of water, which is then pumped into massive toxic tailing ponds. That's very bad news for local Indigenous people living downstream who are reporting alarmingly high cancer rates. Now, looking at these images, it's difficult to grasp the scale of this operation, which can already be seen from space and could grow to an area the size of England. I find it helps actually to look at the dump trucks that move the earth, the largest ever built. That's a person down there by the wheel. My point is that this is not oil drilling. It's not even mining. It is terrestrial skinning. Vast, vivid landscapes are being gutted, left monochromatic gray. Now, I should confess that as far as I'm concerned, this would be an abomination if it emitted not one particle of carbon. But the truth is that on average, turning that gunk into crude oil produces about 3 times more greenhouse gas pollution than it does to produce conventional oil in Canada. How else to describe this but as a form of mass insanity? Just when we know we need to be learning to live on the surface of our planet, off the power of sun, wind, and waves, we are frantically digging to get at the dirtiest, highest emitting stuff imaginable. This is where our story of endless growth has taken us, to this black hole at the center of my country, a place of such planetary pain that, like the BP gusher, one can only stand to look at it for so long.